artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Welcome to episode 307. What is AI doing and going to do to job opportunities? What does it mean to have enough? And who has too little? And what's fair? One answer to that is to look at inequality. How different are the financial circumstances of one set of people compared to another? No, we haven't turned into a macroeconomics show, but inequality is one aspect of macroeconomics that is particularly affected by AI. And here to help us understand that is Jeremy Ney, adjunct professor at Columbia Business School and author of the forthcoming book, The Opportunity Map, about opportunity and inequality in America. He writes the American Inequality newsletter and was previously a macroeconomic policymaker at the Federal Reserve. His work on regional divides and economic mobility has appeared in Time Magazine, Business Insider, BBC, NPR, PBS, and on the TED stage. We're going to talk about how AI affects inequality in job availability, particularly recent college grads, and Jeremy has crunched a lot of current data about that. Is the answer to become a plumber or electrician? Where is the wealth dividend from automation going? We'll talk about the difference between low-wage and low-skill work, the Gini Coefficient, socioeconomic mobility, the cost of higher education versus the college wage premium, and how schools and AI might democratize that dilemma. So let's get on with the interview. Jeremy Ney, thanks for coming on AI and You. And we're here to talk about inequality, which is your wheelhouse and is so important with respect to artificial intelligence these days, because it seems like we are on a one-way street to capital concentrating in the hands of very few people that own the means of production, if we want to go down the Karl Marx road. But that is what it is, artificial intelligence and the prospect of wholesale automation of information work and indeed other kinds of work. Take us into this gradually, if you can. Let's start at the 100,000-foot level and work down. But what do you want to tell us, first of all, about inequality and how you see it changing in the near future?
First off, Peter, thanks so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to join you in the conversation today to discuss AI and inequality. There's really no shortage of issues that are emerging in this space. In some ways, it feels like a new one is, popping up every single day. I think the core issue that, we're really seeing in the data, in regional divides, in growing macro trends is about labor force displacement as a result of AI. And there are wide-ranging estimates on what economic policymakers, banks are predicting we can expect from some job displacement from AI. Estimates from Stanford have really put the number around 6 million jobs, workers that might be displaced from AI. Goldman Sachs actually just put out a report last week saying that they estimate it could be around 11 million people, around 6 to 7% of US workers could be displaced by AI in the coming years. And these workers who are on track to be displaced were really some of the most at-risk workers already. These are people who have highly replaceable skills that could be at risk of AI job loss. So think about secretaries, cashiers, front desk attendants, customer service reps, people who are already earning a pretty low wage. These are the types of jobs that a lot of companies are sort of on track and kind of have in their crosshairs for jobs that they're thinking about displacing. And then there's this second component that you alluded to as well, which is the tremendous growth of wealth that we are seeing on the backs of a lot of this AI growth. So at the same time that we are at risk of losing, 6 to 11 billion workers in their jobs, there's the emergence of this AI aristocracy, right? This group of handful of corporations, very powerful CEOs who are growing their wealth tremendously as data centers are expanding, as these capabilities are growing. So you're seeing this really stark divide between workers who might be at risk of job loss at the same time that a lot of corporations are getting very wealthy off of the process of some of this job loss in turn.
And as we heard in the prologue, you are author of an upcoming book on inequality in America. So the context for those 6 to 11 million job losses is the US, where we have a lot of data, but obviously this extends over the whole world, and we'll get on to some of that more later. But one might say that even 6 to 11 million job loss is not that great in the whole scheme of things when we've heard projections going back a decade of half of jobs being automated away. Are there other effects that we should be looking at beyond just which jobs will be going away? We hear a lot about, for instance, jobs being accelerated and people getting burned out by the amount of work they have to do supervising AI? Or will people retain jobs but be paid less? What sort of other structural changes are we looking at?
The single biggest concern for me in this space is the job loss for recent college grads. So there have been some fascinating studies for these 22 to 25-year-olds and the job loss and displacement from AI here. Eric Brynjolfsson has really helped lead some of the groundbreaking research here. And the reason that this is so dangerous is because you basically lose that first step on the ladder of upward mobility when you aren't able to land a strong job coming out of college. So right now, for the first time in decades, that age group of 22 to 25-year-olds actually has a higher unemployment rate than the US unemployment rate. So those 22 to 25-year-olds has a 6% unemployment rate compared to the national rate of 4.3, 4.4% right now. And that has really never occurred in the US's history in many ways. We tend to get it sometimes like during COVID or during the Great Recession, during these market anomaly moments. But generally, these recent college grads have just upskilled, right? They've just been in these fantastic universities learning how to come into the workforce. And what we're seeing is that companies are saying, we actually don't want to be hiring those workers. We think many of their jobs could be automated by AI, things that analysts were doing or sales reps or kind of recent hires. And when you don't have that strong first step in your career, if you don't have that foundation to start launching yourself up the economic ladder, it's as though the first rung, right, of that ladder has disappeared for you. And that can make it really hard to rise over the course of your career. So I think for me, we talk, even if we aren't so worried about this 6 to 11 million number, which is still quite significant, these long-term impacts of this entire generation of college grads who are struggling to find their footing as they're coming out of school, that is kind of quite a big concern for me.
You wrote something in an article on Medium that I want to reconcile with this because it seems to contradict that. You said low-wage jobs tend to have the lowest exposure to generative AI, which sounds like that would pull down the people who are already privileged because the higher-wage jobs would have the greater exposure, and presumably that's the ones that are like software developers and so forth. Can you reconcile that conclusion with the effect on entry-level jobs?
Yeah, so there's this interesting dichotomy here between, low-wage work and low-skill work, which economists generally conflate the two. They tend to say, if you are offering a low wage for a job, that the economic principle would also say, that is because we maybe don't value that skill as highly or in certain ways. And generally for low-wage workers, many of them are stand at risk of unemployment. Like I mentioned, secretaries, cashiers, some desk attendants. But you also have some of these lower wage workers who are actually not at risk of AI job displacements. Things like plumbers or electricians, roofers, people working in construction, which don't tend to offer, high salaries, but we have really not made as strong advances on the robotics fronts that could displace some of those workers as we have on the software side of things. And so it's really kind of this difference between where we're talking about low wage versus low skill work. And you tend to see some breakouts in where we're talking about that because there are some low wage work that is highly protected from AI job loss. We don't expect that to happen. I think one of the other aspects that I had mentioned in that article on low wage work was the ability to withstand the shocks from this AI job loss. And so when you are a low wage worker, you have fewer savings, you have less of a cushion, you have less of a capacity to engage in some upskilling or job training program that could maybe help you get back into the workforce. And so when you're in that category of lower wage or low skill work that can be at risk of job loss and you haven't built up that reserve to be able to withstand that loss, those are the workers who I think stand at really high risk of falling into poverty and really struggling to emerge from poverty because they don't have the types of skills that the workforce tends to be looking for right now.
I got to be honest, when I look at a plumbing bill, I don't think of that as a low-paid job, but doubtless there's some overhead there involved that I'm unaware of, and I'll get angry letters from plumbers. But are we looking at a kind of divergence here of people taking up trade jobs as seeking some refuge from the assault of AI on information work?
I think you might start seeing more of that as people are looking towards the trades as a not only refuge from possible AI job loss, but also as the shape of higher education is changing as well. So many people no longer feel that the contract with higher education, that a 4-year degree is the pathway to the middle class and to, upper middle income life. They see much more so that, 2-year programs or certificates or trade programs can, in fact, accrue way less debt for them and still offer some of these strong paying jobs that also might not be displaced as quickly as we thought. And so I agree, that might be a trend that we start to see more people moving into those types of roles. I think it then begs the sort of broader question of how does career and upward mobility continue to expand for people in those jobs, right? Even the highest paid plumber, I don't think is probably making that much, though I do share your concern that I also get very high plumbing bills. How can we make sure that people continue to have those paths beyond just the middle class, but into upper and higher income lifestyles in America?
Inequality has two sides, and we've been talking about one side of it. But then there's the other side, which is the increasing accumulation of wealth, and a whole lot has been made about the 1% and the 0.1% and the 0.0001%. And there are numerous statistics, feel free to quote any of them because they're always worth listening to, about the proportion of wealth that is concentrating in those areas down to what we could characterize as almost a handful of people. And that drives some of this conversation as well, because inequality levels are often linked to social unrest and disturbance like that. What is the consequence of inequality from not just people being pulled down at low end, but seeing these people being raised to these stratospheric levels on the other end?
This is such a difficult part of a lot of these inequality conversations, right? Which is how can we not only reduce inequality, but do so in a way that I think still reflects our American values. And I have experienced, writing about inequality and working on this topic for, over a decade, that even bringing up inequality creates this sense of concern from a lot of people because they worry that it necessarily requires redistribution, that it is also very much so associated with very intense attacks on billionaires and whatnot. And I think for me, part of the way that I see it is, yes, we are living in a world where corporate profits are the highest that they have been in 80 years. We are living in a time where the gap between the highest paid worker and the lowest paid worker at the top 500 companies in the US is at some of the widest points that we have ever seen. But I also think that there is a world where we can do more to kind of lift the bottom, right, of our workforce of, Americans who we are leaving behind to narrow a lot of those gaps. Not only it requires pushing down on the top here, but really, as you mentioned, part of the biggest concerns with inequality is that it makes it far less difficult for anyone to rise up the economic ladder. So it isn't just the people who are living in poverty. Some work from Alan Kruger and kind of generally referred to as the Great Gatsby curve helps show that in countries with higher rates of inequality, it is much more difficult, yes, for anyone to rise up, not just the people at the top of the income distribution, but the bottom as well. And so here on this AI debate and where we're now seeing this tremendous growth, like so much of the S&P really has been led by these 7 companies that have this incredible CapEx investments in data centers that are kind of making these new product announcements all of the time that continue to, boost their stock prices. I think more so about what we can do to sort of lift up the much broader swath of workers who are being impacted by this than I think we need to necessarily focus on the top. This AI aristocracy, I do worry about quite a bit and sort of this runaway growth that we're seeing there. But my focus is really on how can we stop the bottom from continuing to fall out for so many Americans? The safety net for these workers has really disappeared. We used to have job training programs that Kennedy had rolled out when there were all of these broad automations coming, Nixon as well, and we've really disbanded a lot of those. Largely under Reagan, as we had focused more on helping the private sector invest in this instead of creating public sector supports. And without a lot of that initiative from the private sector to actually think about how they can retrain a lot of their workers instead of saying I just have 40,000 workers now and I want to cut that down to 10,000. How can you work to make sure that those 30,000 are actually in a better place before putting them into new roles in your company that would help you continue to grow further?
I want to stay on this topic of the relative difference between the top and the bottom here, because it seems a fundamental of human psychology that in order to judge how well we're doing, we do that in comparison to other people. I could look at the people in the lowest rungs of society today and say, well, you're a lot better off than most people at the higher rungs were in the 1300s. That's not going to give them any comfort. And the place that I usually read about that works on quantifying this is the Gini Coefficient. And I've seen things saying lower Gini Coefficient equals happier people. Can you tell us, what the Gini Coefficient is and what your thinking is on how that relates to our general levels of satisfaction?
Yeah, so the Gini coefficient is really a economic measure of inequality. It ranges from 0 to 1, where a score of 0 represents perfect equality and a score of 1 represents perfect inequality. It is a helpful measure for looking across countries to understand where every nation basically lies on this distribution. Most advanced economies have a Gini coefficient somewhere between 0.25 and 0.45. And when we talk about perfect equality here, what we really mean is that everybody has the exact same amount of money, and perfect inequality would mean that one person has all of the money and everybody else has no money. And I think there has been some quite interesting research showing that there is some amount of inequality that you will tend to have in capitalist countries, and that can both be beneficial and hurtful to growth, depending where you are on this other economic curve known as the Kuznets curve. And what people generally talk about in this space on the Gini coefficient is where actually does it matter that you are on some measure. Personally, I find the Gini coefficient sort of a simplistic measure of inequality, particularly in the US, where we have such regional divides. It often misses much of the nuance that you'll see within certain states or even within communities. I live in Brooklyn. What happens in upstate New York is so incredibly different than what is going on in New York City. The northern or southern parts of just about any state, you tend to see that these huge divides. And so I think this simplistic number from 0 to 1 sort of misses a lot of that nuance on inequality. We are at this point now, though, where focusing, I think, in particular on economic mobility and our ability to move up from lower income into middle income into upper income lives is really the measure of inequality that I tend to focus on. And there have been some fantastic researchers, Raj Chetty in particular, who has done quite a bit to measure our ability to move up the economic ladder, what Chetty refers to as the opportunity atlas here. And what we observe on these measures of economic mobility, and in some ways a measure of just the American dream more broadly, is that people who were born in the 1950s, there was a 90% chance that they would do better than their parents. They would move up the economic ladder. But to children born today, it's just a coin flip, whether or not you are more likely to earn more than your parents. And so even though the Gini coefficient has kind of only moved a handful of decimal points over that period, our ability to achieve the American dream has drastically decreased, in part because our inequality has increased so much. And so for me, that's one of these kind of core measures that I look at on inequality. Can we in fact do better than our parents? Can we continue to achieve this American dream of moving up the economic ladder generation after generation? Yes, we have bigger homes. Yes, our cars are larger. Yes, they are safer. We have seatbelts. We have cell phones in our pockets that have the entire internet. We can listen to as much music as we want. We have air conditioning. We are much more comfortable. Our food is healthier. It's more abundant. Our air is cleaner. So in many measures, our lives are drastically improved, not even just comparing to the 1300s, just even over the last 50, 70 years. But on that core measure of economic mobility, of our ability to achieve the American dream, people born today are doing far worse.
Where does the United States stand or rank with respect to other countries on that upward mobility?
The U.S. ranks quite poorly on economic mobility here. I think in part because we have allowed the bottom to really fall away for a lot of the U.S. Really high poverty rates for so many folks have been a real drawdown for them. Specific characteristics of the U.S., namely student debt and medical debt, have also drastically increased. Childcare costs that also have created these barriers and headwinds to rising up the economic ladder that you don't tend to see in other places. And when we even look at some of our biggest global rivals like China, for example, they have tended to have a much higher rate of economic mobility, this tremendous growth of people from, poverty into the middle class and upper middle class that we actually haven't observed as strongly in the US. Similarly, in India, you tend to see this, very high growth too.
So doesn't that draw a direct line between wealth redistribution and upward mobility? Because that medical debt and student debt was less when we had eras of greater social welfare, money going into healthcare, greater support of the educational system. Now those expenses have been shifted more to the individual.
Partially, I'd say a higher tax rate on the upper earners, a higher marginal tax rate would be able to fund a lot more of our social services. And in the past, we had a top marginal tax rate as high as 90% that was very much so being cut from that point. But I also think about the ways that we have set up some of these systems that put exorbitant costs onto individuals, right? The runaway cost of universities, of healthcare, right? You could have a universal healthcare system, right? And figuring out the funding for that is, I think, probably beyond the scope of this conversation. But the ways that we could decrease people's medical debt, that we could decrease the cost of college, that we could make it easier for people to afford childcare, those types of things would make it much more simple for people to, or understandable for people to rise up the ladder. The way that we fund that is a quite large policy question.
Let's look at just the tuition question for a moment, because I've seen some information about that I think is interesting in this respect. There are published curves that show lifetime expected income for people with or without degrees of different kinds, and they're quite clear that if you get a degree, you have a higher lifetime income. And I could easily argue that a market-based system looks at that and says, you're going to earn X amount of dollars extra in your life. That represents the value, therefore, of getting this degree, and that's what we're going to charge you for it. Or as long as we charge even slightly less than that, you'll conclude that it's worth it. And that's a lot of money. So that could be what's driving the cost of that up. Or maybe it's due to the availability of student loans and the structure of that. But what do you think the driver is there? Because another one of these statistics I've heard is that the cost of tuition has gone up faster than the rate of inflation for many years.
That's correct. The cost of tuition has been rising faster than inflation for many years. The average cost for public college and private tuition is about 3 times higher today than it was in 1973. And the costs, I think, in part, as you're referring to, there is this existence of what's called the college wage premium, right? How much more you earn as a result of having a college degree versus a peer who has not earned that college degree. And that premium very much so exists, as much as people like Peter Thiel love to poo-poo against, the benefit of higher education. But the college wage premium has almost always existed, right, in U.S. history. Like, it's not like we are now seeing such a high, right, benefit of this college wage premium. Some people put it as like you earn 65 to 80% more than someone who only has a high school degree. There have been also estimates where people try to put out the entire lifetime benefit earnings of going to college versus not. And you'll see estimates anywhere between, $1.5 to $3 million there. But I think when we talk about the student debt that people are saddled with, anywhere in the range of, $250,000 to $500,000, and the interest rate that is posed on top of that, it could be possible that people aren't paying off of their student debts until they're 55, 60, 65. And that can make it feel like for many people, what was the cost of it really worth it? I was carrying around this baggage for so long, even though I knew I was still earning more than, what I would have made otherwise. I think we're also seeing this big divergence of earning depending on what school you go to. Georgetown really did this fascinating study in the last 6 months talking about what is the ROI of basically every university in the US and for different degrees. And you see these really stark differences between some schools that charge these exorbitant prices, but don't really offer those same types of returns to folks. And then there's this upper echelon of schools, generally what's called the Ivy League Plus, so the Ivy League schools, including Stanford and Duke and MIT. And so even though the graduates of the Ivy League Plus are just part of like a very small percent of the population, something like 0.1%, they represent 12% of all Fortune 500 CEOs, 32% of all New York Times journalists, and 13% of like the wealthiest Americans in the US. And so your ability to getting into these top tier schools can really accelerate your growth, but getting into perhaps like a middling school that has like a really bad ROI and yet still saddles you with $250,000 in debt can feel like you've made a really bad bargain in thinking about your upward trajectory in the US, even though generally the college wage premium still exists for schools.
If I look at the potential for AI to disrupt that system, the ability of generative AI to act as a tutor that provides a large proportion of the education that has otherwise cost a large amount for people and is now virtually free is a potential game changer. Do you think that that could be mobilized to correct some of that inequality, or are there structural motivations in the system to counter that?
Yes, with a very strong caveat. There is such a powerful potential for these individualized tutors for you to be able to learn in the ways that reflect your brain and mind and understanding of the world. Oxford and Cambridge have had this model for years of this like direct teaching where it's basically one teacher with 2 students for so long because they think they've learned at how powerful it can be when you have that direct teaching approach. And many of the leading AI companies in the education space are often thinking about that same model of how you can basically have a personalized tutor in front of you who can teach you at your pace what you want visually, analytically, in whatever ways. But my big caveat on this, and the reason that so much of my work focuses on communities, regional divides, what is happening in certain places, is that that narrative does not make sense for a very broad swath of America. For my book, one of the counties that I profile is in West Virginia, one of the coal mining capital of the world, and also one of the areas that was most strongly hit by the opioid epidemic. And then talking with coal miners there who have lost their jobs, who have been really struggling under so many of these physical and mental health care disparities, they go online and the first thing that they see when they're trying to find a new job is about a coding boot camp. And that just does not make sense for them. There are no jobs for them there. Even if they could work remotely, it's very difficult for them. They don't have certain skill sets or understanding to really be moving into that space. And so, while I do think that there is a tremendous potential for AI to help level some of the playing field in these educational disparities, I think you really have to look at some of these place-based understandings of these issues, because for migrant workers in Southern California or coal miners in West Virginia or preschool teachers, right, in Southern Mississippi, that type of model might not make sense for them. And I think there can be a glowing Silicon Valley narrative that is going to kind of be this holy grail for education, for upskilling. And when we look in certain places, that just isn't the right solution for them.
Is there a responsibility that the universities have here, or even just the opportunity to help with this? I feel like I've been thinking all along that they're essentially prisoners of some invisible hand here, but that's never completely true. And are they just sitting around fat, dumb, and happy with the way things are at the moment? Or are they facing a disruption that makes some of them quail with fear? And is there the possibility that they could be the agents of change here rather than just what feels like spectators?
The top universities can do far more than they are to help level the playing field and address some of these inequalities. Some of them are sitting around and being fat, dumb, and happy. I don't have as much empathy for them on sort of some of the systems that they have set up. In part, I think a lot about legacy admissions here and the prioritization that you tend to see for legacy admissions at a lot of these top tier schools, where they want to bring you in because your mother or father was already there, your grandfather donated a building. And that continues to widen a lot of these divides. You are only giving opportunities to people who already had the opportunity in the past. And you're tending to see more schools start to move away from legacy admissions. I think one of the top examples of this is MIT. That when you look at some of this data that was done by David Deming and Raj Chetty, you tend to see that MIT basically stands out as an outlier among schools in creating these huge economic gains for its graduates and alumni, while also lifting up people from lower income, even poverty wages as well. And so those schools that can actually do that work of taking people from the bottom 20% and putting them into the top 20%, there's much more that schools can do when they deprioritize legacy admissions, when they deprioritize athletes, when they try and take away some of these things like the focus on extracurriculars. Schools as well saw when they removed SAT and ACT scores that they also tended to widen inequality by only focusing on students who could go to elite private or public schools, who could afford really expensive clarinet and cello lessons. And so when you can create systems that actually focus on what are the outcomes that you want to achieve, what is your goal as a university? Is it to increase your endowment at Harvard, or is it to raise people from the bottom 20% to the upper 20%? And I think when you really codify that as your goal, you might change the way that you do admissions. You might change the way that you think about the types of jobs that you want to put your students into. And you might also think about how you are the tuition that you require of your students, or the financial aid that you can offer, or how much goes into research and instead because you just want another fancy publication in Nature or Science.
I sense that there's a whole lot more that you could and would like to say on this, and I would love to hear it, but we're about to pivot to something different. That's the end of the first half of the interview. You know the drill. I find this conversation is really helping me make better distinctions about the future job market and the differential between high and low paid workers. Oh, by the way, there was a mention in there of the Kuznets curve, and I looked that up for you. It's a model by Simon Kuznets that there is an inverted U-shaped relationship, suggesting that as an economy develops, income inequality first rises, peaks, then declines, essentially claiming that rapid economic growth accelerates income inequality until it gets to the point where a post-industrial society can shift to services and has the wherewithal to improve education and welfare, thus lowering inequality as it cares more about helping everyone. Obviously, you can argue with this, and people do, especially about what's been happening in the US for the last few decades, where the curve has turned up since the 70s. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, and very much in line with a recurring theme on this show, workforce analytics company ActiveTrack analyzed work activity across 164,000 employees in 1,100 organizations over 3 years, only to find that AI is actually increasing the average workload of employees. Quote, "The data is unambiguous. AI does not reduce workloads." End quote. They wrote as reported in The Guardian. The same report featured interviews with a group of Amazon corporate employees who said that the company's internal push for all employees to use AI tools was actually unhelpful and just added to their workload, often making mistakes that they had to correct. An Amazon spokesperson disagreed and said that they were seeing employees spend less time on rote work. My take is that both can be true, and that while we may see some general trends for a while that indicate negative results, it will be highly variable depending on company and even work group. Aggregate statistics and studies will not be reliable guides to what any given business might experience, and that will depend heavily on the company culture. I've said for many years that AI amplifies and accelerates what happens at a company, and that includes dysfunctionality. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Jeremy Ney, when we'll talk about universal basic income, taxes, and other systems of wealth redistribution, whether AI should be treated as a public utility, AI and redlining, AI causing cognitive inequalities in education, and where we should be leaning on for change. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.